So we were discussing yesterday the status of a eunuch, and we looked at various opinions about the eunuch and someone who was naturally a eunuch or perhaps a man-made eunuch. And the Mishnah is going to conclude now, the fifth Mishnah of the 8th chapter. Hasaris lo choletz velo miyabam. A eunuch can't perform chalitza or yibum. That's essentially the conclusion of the Mishnah. Because the whole purpose of yibum is to create a descendant for a dead brother. And if the eunuch's if he can't do that, then there's no yibum. There's no yibum at all. And so the Mishnah then goes on to say, "V'chein elionit." An elionit is someone who's congenitally incapable of having children. So this is not someone who's infertile. It's someone who doesn't have a womb. I mean, in other words, who's like a eunuch, someone who doesn't have the necessary organs to have children. So, and her status is just like eunuch. V'chein ha'elionit lo choletzet velo mitya bamet. She doesn't perform chalitza, and you don't perform yibum with her. So, in other words, the whole issue about yibum and chalitza just doesn't exist. Doesn't exist. If her husband dies, and her husband is childless, then her husband's brother has no obligation to perform yibum, and she has no need to perform chalitza. So the Mishnah then goes on to say, and the same, we're going to describe now the operation with a eunuch, but the same would be true of an elonit. Hasaris shechalatz livamto lo psala. So a eunuch performs chalitza for his yevamot. And there's no need to do this because we've explained already in the Mishnah. The eunuch, hasaris lo choletz velo miyabam. He doesn't need to perform, he can't perform yibum, he doesn't need to perform chalitza. If he goes ahead and does it, hasaris shechalatz livamto lo psala. He doesn't disqualify her. And this means, by the way, he doesn't disqualify her from later marrying a priest. So if you've received chalitza, if a widow receives chalitza, then or performs chalitza, she acquires a status of a divorced woman. So she can't marry a priest. But in this case, the chalitza has no meaning at all. It's not necessary. So there's nothing to stop. If a eunuch performs chalitza for his yevamah, he doesn't do anything. It's a meaningless legal act. She can go ahead and marry a priest. It's as if nothing happened at all. So far, so good. But the Mishnah goes on. But Allah, what if he had intercourse with her? It's not quite clear how the eunuch has the whole idea of a eunuch having intercourse with his sister-in-law isn't quite clear. But we learned, and by the way, my wife tells me that in the Ottoman period there were two kinds of eunuchs, and some kinds of eunuchs who were most prized just had their testes cut off. So, and then they could continue to have sexual intercourse. So maybe this is what we're talking about here. But Allah, so if he did have intercourse with her, he does disqualify her from marrying a priest because this is an act of promiscuity. And the Mishnah here is not talking about an act of promiscuity just because he's had intercourse with someone who he's not married to, but because he's had a sexual relationship with his brother's wife. And his brother's wife is forbidden. And we learned right at the beginning of the tractate that the whole question of levirate marriage is in a delicate balance because on one hand, the Torah prohibits a person from marrying his brother's wife. And on the other hand, it commands him, if his brother dies childless, to take on his brother's wife to raise a child. So we're in this delicate balance. And essentially the halacha permits, it permits someone to marry their brother's wife if yibum is necessary, but it absolutely forbids them to do it in any other case. And because, well, we've said hasarish, the eunuch doesn't perform chalitza and doesn't perform yibum. He has no get out clause. He has no get out of jail card. from the prohibition of having a sexual relationship with his brother's wife. And that's why it's an act of promiscuity. Ba'ala for Salah, if he had sex with her, he's effectively cut her off from marrying a priest afterwards, because it's an act of promiscuity to have a sexual relationship with your sister-in-law. And it works the same way for an Elonit. If he has, it works the same way for an Elonit. If the brothers performed chalitza for an Elonit, they don't disqualify her, because the whole act of chalitza has no meaning for the Elonit. The Elonit is someone who can't bear children. She doesn't need to do yibum. She doesn't need to do chalitza. The act of chalitza is completely meaningless. It doesn't disqualify her from marrying a priest. But this is the mirror image, is the mirror image of the other case. But aluha, if they had intercourse with her, they disqualify, because this too is an act of promiscuity. You can't have a sexual relationship with your sister-in-law outside the framework of yibum. And with this statement, the Mishnah is now going to segue gently from eunuchs to hermaphrodites. So the Mishnah is going to declare, Saris Chama Kohen, a priest who is a natural eunuch. Saris Chama, remember we explained in the previous Mishnah, in the two Mishnayot ago, Saris Chama is someone who the son never saw in any other way, i.e. he was a eunuch from birth. Saris Chama, natural eunuch, basically. Saris Chama Kohen. So this natural eunuch is also a Kohen. Shena Salavat Yisrael, and he married. He married a Jewish girl who's not the daughter of a Kohen. So this allows her to eat truma. Machila bi truma. So her status, by virtue of being married to him, even though he's a eunuch, I guess the marriage can't be consummated, even though he's a eunuch, her status is altered and she can eat truma. And then Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon go on to say, they're going to extend this from the priest who's a eunuch to a priest who's a hermaphrodite. Rabbi Yossi via Rabbi Shimon omrim, androgynous, kohen, shinasalavat Yisrael machila bitruma. Similarly, it goes exactly the same way. A priest who is a hermaphrodite married the daughter of an Israelite, and she too can eat truma. In other words, the act of marrying that kohen was a valid act of marriage. She comes into his house, she can eat truma. Now, we learned in the 4th chapter of Bikurim, the 4th chapter of the tractate of first fruits, about the effectively the 4 genders that the Mishnah recognizes, and it recognizes men and women. And we learned, let's just go back to the Mishnah in Bikurim and just remind ourselves what the Mishnah there said. It's the beginning of the 4th chapter of Bikurim. Androgynous yeshbo derachim shavel anashim v'yeshbo derachim shavel nashim. A hermaphrodite is in some ways like men, and in some ways like women. And in some ways he's like men and women, and in some ways he's like neither men nor women. So an androgynous, a hermaphrodite, is the best translation of androgynous, is someone who basically has dual sexual organs. And Rabbi Yossi says, by the way, at the end of that chapter, Rabbi Yossi Omer, androgynous, bria bifnei atzmahu velo yachlu chachamim lahachriya alav. The hermaphrodite is a unique creature, and the sages couldn't decide about it. They didn't know what he was. But aval tumtum, that is not so with a tumtum. So while an androgynous, a hermaphrodite, is someone with both male and female organs, a tumtum is someone who doesn't seem to have any sexual organs at all. Maybe they're inside, most likely they're inside his skin. So it's as if his testes haven't descended. His sexual organs are hidden inside his skin, So we don't quite know what gender he belongs to. That's essentially the tumtum. And the Mishnah concludes, tumtum eino ken. A tumtum is not this unique creature. Parmim shehu ish, parmim shehu isha. Sometimes he's a man and sometimes he's a woman. So that's how the Mishnah concludes at the end of the 4th chapter of Bikurim. So let's now come back to our Mishnah. We've discussed the eunuch. We've discussed the hermaphrodite. Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon say androgynous kohen shenasalavat Yisrael machilen bitruma. A priest who's a hermaphrodite married the daughter of an Israelite, and this allows her to eat truma. Rabbi Yudah is now going to add. Rabbi Yudah Omer, tumtum shenikra v'nimtza zachar. If a tumtum was torn, so a tumtum is injured, and he's found to be male. So maybe he's injured and he's found to have male organs. Lo yachalotz mipnei hu k'saris. He doesn't perform chalitza because he's like a saris. Rabbi Yudah is assuming that even though he has male organs, because they haven't descended properly, effectively, he's like a eunuch. He can't use these male organs. So he has the status of a eunuch. He doesn't perform chalitza. Clearly, he's not going to perform yibum. And then we're going to quote a halacha that we learned actually. It's sort of carbon copied actually from the chapter in Bikurim. Androgynous nose avol lo nise. A hermaphrodite can marry, but can't be married. And this is something to do with the sage's view of marriage. I think essentially the Mishnah is saying that a man can't marry a hermaphrodite. A man can't marry hermaphrodite, but a hermaphrodite can marry a woman. So I guess in this state, the Mishnah seems to be suggesting that he's more like a man in this sense. And then Rabbi Eliezer is going to conclude, Rabbi Eliezer Omer chayavin alav skila k'zachar, someone's liable to be stoned on his account like a male. And this is a reference to promiscuous sex. So for which the punishment in the Torah is stoning, is skila. And so, again, I think Rabbi Eliezer is also seems to be tending to say that the hermaphrodite is a male, because there's a punishment of stoning for promiscuous intercourse.